All right, hi everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I was reflecting this morning on like two things that Kelsey said yesterday. One is around like it's really important to know what the technology is good for and what it's not good for. And then the second thing is kind of like, hey, we're doing too much experimentation because we're not clear on what's going on. And the reason why we're not clear is because maybe the destination isn't clear, or maybe it's because actually we haven't talked to people who have done this before and we're repeating the same mistakes that other people have made. So I would kind of like to use this talk to address both of those points, so that like all of us, as we start experimenting with generative AI, we can do a better job. One of my favorite like sci-fi quotes is from William Gibson, which is like, look, the future is already here. It's just not uniformly distributed. And the key to living in the future is to hang out with people that are on the right-hand side of that distribution. In case you're wondering, yes, that's a generative AI-generated clip art to that quote. I made it with Midjourney. I know the through line of this talk is supposed to be about value, but actually, I think the real through line is Volkswagen, because it's making an appearance in every single presentation. All right, so let's talk about it. So like, why do I think I have any reason to talk about like the mistakes? Well, the main reason is like the company I work for, Bain Company, which is like one of the biggest strategy firms in the world. We've been doing this for about 2 years now. We're primarily a strategy company, but we do have like a lot of tech talent. So when our clients' problems require some sort of technical solution, we have a small bench of talent that can kind of take care of that. And we've been working with OpenAI for about 2 years now. It started 2 years ago when we diligenced OpenAI on behalf of several venture capital companies who wanted to invest. And that's kind of how the relationship got started. And we were kind of like the first consulting firm to create partnership with them. So at this point, we built dozens of proof of concepts and MEPs with them. And as a result, we have lots of scars on our back about like how to do things and how not to do things. Given that I was already introduced, I'm going to skip my introduction. All right, so how are we going to do this? I want to do it in 3 different steps. Like 1, just kind of get everybody to the same level of understanding. When we say generative AI, what do we mean by that? Then 2, talk about like where can it add value and what are the areas where actually it can't. It's a bad idea to use it for. And then the third part is like, okay, once you figure out where you want to use it, what are like all the landmines you're going to walk into that you want to avoid because we walked onto them and you guys don't have to. So let's start with generative AI first. One of the ways I like to kind of like talk about it is not about the history or like how it evolved out of AI, but actually talk about how is it different from kind of the traditional AI all of us have been working on for the last decade. The biggest misconception I see is people think that generative AI is some sort of superset of regular old AI, and it's not. There's some overlap between the two, but it's generally about net new use cases. So traditional AI, it's all about solving one problem in one domain. And you get all the data in that one domain, and when you train the model, it can only solve that one domain. Generative AI, by contrast, that general stands for like general pre-trained, right? Meaning that you can actually apply it to many different problems, and it actually does reasonably well. It's not so much as a machine learning tool as it is a general purpose engine. And one of the big issues, and why people keep dismissing it, is because people try to use it as a database, and it's actually like a really crappy database if you think about it. It's really just a general purpose engine is how you need to think about it. It's a reasoning engine. Traditional AI, it's all about patterns in the data, and then you give it similar data, and it can like figure out what the pattern is. Generative AI, it's all about creating new content. Traditional AI, mostly about numbers, or if it's not numbers, it's basically masquerading as a number. Like a segmentation is a typical thing you would do. But really, to a machine learning algorithm, there is no segment. There's just segment number 1, segment number 2, segment number 3. It's still a number. And generally, the way it's been used is to help kind of like in decision support, right? So it's like demand forecasting, kind of propensity to buy, fraud detection. By the way, if you guys didn't watch the presentation by Natasha and Damir yesterday on fraud detection, it was an excellent presentation on like what it takes to build a fraud detection engine. So if you haven't watched it, definitely watch it on review after this conference. For generative AI, it's actually about like unstructured data in and out, and it's about brand new use cases like new images, new content. It's about summarizing and extracting, and it's about like interacting with the program using natural language. And then one thing it's really bad at that nobody talks about, it's really bad at math and traditional analytics, right? If you try to do demand forecasting with generative AI, it's going to fail epically. And like, while it is two different use cases, actually what we found at Bain, that if you actually figure out a way to combine the two, where this tells you what to do, and this tells you how to do it, that's where like real magic happens. So, the AI nerds, they like to talk about modalities, which is just like a really stupid, fancy way of saying different types of unstructured data. To date, the areas where like generative AI can do a good job is kind of text, image, code, speech, and video. There's many others, but these are kind of the most well-developed ones. I'm not going to go super deep on this. But if you just go really deep on kind of like the text stuff, the things you can do is like things like dialogue, right? You can actually interact with it in like a natural language. It's really good at summarizing. It's good at translating. It's really good at kind of extracting relevant information from the text that it gets from unstructured data. And it's really good at creating like new text based on some sort of a prompt. So the really interesting thing about this technology is that if you go back 3, certainly 5 years back, each one of these use cases would have been a completely different machine learning model, each one requiring like at least 1 million data points to do a decent job, right? The cool like emergent properties that we didn't expect when we trained these is that it can actually do all of these completely off the shelf, right? And even in kind of like new areas where like you're trying to get it to do like new response generation, when we used to do this 3 years ago, it would be like 1 million data points to do it. And now when we do it, we find that like you need like 100 or like 1,000, and it actually starts doing a pretty decent job. And what that means is like a whole bunch of use cases you couldn't do before because you just didn't have enough data now actually become possible, which is like really exciting. And then the other really exciting thing is we did this one crazy proof of concept for a Brazilian bank where we did a chatbot to automate what humans did, and we fed it all the stuff in Portuguese, and it did an excellent job. We didn't train her in English, and we learned very quickly that actually if you speak to the chatbot in English, it'll respond in English like it's no problem. But actually, I'm from Croatia, as mentioned. I actually started chatting with it in Croatian. It could totally do it. And I'm 100% sure there wasn't a single training example in that data set of somebody speaking to an agent in Brazil in Croatian. So that's an example of like it does dialogue and immediately can also do translation without even being asked to do. Like I didn't tell it, please start talking to me in Croatian. I just asked the next question in Croatian, and it was like, cool, the rest of this conversation is in Croatian. I get it. And it just kept doing it. So it's like really exciting. That being said, there's a lot of hype here, a ton of it. And unfortunately, a lot of that hype is about how this is going to automate everything. And that's just not true. Like any technology, kind of augmentation comes first. And once technology gets proven, only then and then only can you move kind of into like the automating phase, right? So if you look at the last generation of AI, kind of the traditional AI, it was mostly decision support, which means there was always a human in the loop, right? There was a machine learning demand forecasting, but some human would look at that and actually like tweak it up and down to make a decision. The only place where the traditional AI actually totally automated stuff is things that would have never been done by a human before. Like, and really it's like, Facebook Meta, they were like the biggest user of AI ML, and the way they used it in a fully automated way is kind of recommending which stories or ads you should see. But if you think about it, like that's never going to be done by a human, right? It's like ridiculous to think that for you and you only, there's some human somewhere being like, I think Kreshimir would really enjoy this article. Like it's just not going to happen, right? And I think this wave 2 is going to be similar. In the beginning, because these things hallucinate, it's all going to be augment, kind of this co-pilot mode, right? And once we figure out how to like solve the hallucination problem, then and then only are we going to start to see some of like this being put in like the automated deployment mode. And I think all 50 of the deployments we've done with our clients to date, I think every single one of them has been in that kind of co-pilot augment mode. Cool. So that's generative AI. So let's talk about like how this creates value. So generally, it's kind of like 4 vectors of value that this technology can do. The first one is what everybody kind of focuses on, which is for a lot of tasks, it can do same or better as a human at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the speed. And then you get to decide if that means that you just need less humans, or like, cool, those humans can now do like a lot more other more valuable work, right? Which is actually like a lot of our clients choose to do the latter. Then the second two about customization speed, this is mostly kind of in marketing and copywriting, where like now you can actually like create highly customized marketing campaigns. and you can create them in seconds, which means that all of a sudden you go from like mass market to a few segments to like a segment of one. And then the last one is actually the most exciting one, but not a lot of people are talking about it, which is because these systems are so good at synthesizing all the knowledge that the organization has, because they're so good at taking unstructured data and understanding what it means. A lot of places where we put them is as knowledge assistants. And what they do as knowledge assistant is essentially expose the knowledge of the whole organization. And in places where this has been deployed, what ends up happening, kind of like the bottom half of the performers in the organization, all of a sudden become almost as good as the top half, right? Because they have access to all the knowledge of the organization, and these knowledge assistants are really good at summarizing it in a way in which they can like pretend like they actually had that knowledge all along. So that's an area that like at Bain we're super excited about. It's not good for everything. There's a bunch of things you shouldn't use it for. Certainly should not use it without a human in the loop right now. That would be sheer insanity. The kind of things that it is good at, it's generally going to cover a lot of these kind of like 4 things that we look for. One, you want to look for things that like the entire company is doing, and the reason for, or like a lot of people are doing. And the reason for that is that's the only way you're going to find value, right? A lot of people have to do it such that if you can automate it, you can create some real savings. But then there's the second thing, the but. The task has to be grammatical. And what do I mean by that? It can be completely made up. There has to be some sort of like pattern to how like this content is generated that it can kind of figure out and replicate. If it's completely insane, like it too will be completely insane. Then the second thing, it's all about unstructured data. The third thing is not required, but it's nice, which is like the way users interact with it today has a lot of friction and it's not smooth, so this helps. And then the last one is really, really important. Either the problem has to be non-deterministic, which is a really fancy way of saying, there's no right answer. There's many right-ish answers, and all the right-ish answers are good enough, right? Like for example, like in marketing, there is no like one winning best campaign. There's a bunch of different campaigns that could work. There is no right one. Or if it's a non-deterministic problem, if it's not that, there's a set of options you can choose from such that it's not hallucinating, and it can do a really good job of choosing the right thing. So generally, you want to like hit 3 out of these 4, or at least 2 out of these 4 for this to be valuable. So where are people using it? So this is fresh off the press. We ran it like 3 weeks ago, a survey with 500 companies, mostly in the US, but some in Europe and Asia, and kind of ask them, like, hey guys, are you guys using generative AI? And kind of the down arrow is like actually 40% of companies are trying or at least experimenting with one use case already. Now this is a little weighted towards tech companies, which were 1/3 of the sample, so that probably like boosted up a little bit. But actually it's a pretty high number given that this technology really has been out for 6 months only. What's really interesting is like what comes up on top. So the top 2 are probably driven by the fact that 1/3 of the sample is in tech, which is people are adding kind of chat UX interface to the software products, and people are massively adopting coding copilots. Probably not as interesting for this group. I think what's interesting for this group is like the next 4. Right, so the next 4 that are most likely to be adopted is things for customer support, contact center, knowledge assistance. And when we do knowledge assistance, like 75% of the time, it's in sales and marketing, IT administration, and kind of like marketing material development. And then there's a long tail of other stuff that like not as popular for people to do, but people are trying. So if you kind of double click into like just the top 2. So the chat UX is this kind of concept that has taken the valley by storm, which is this idea that chatbot, it's interesting, but frankly, it's a little bit of a distraction. And actually, chat UX is the really interesting thing here, because chatbots is a read-only interface. You talk to the chatbot, and you read something from its database, and that's it. What a lot of companies are experimenting with is this chat UX, where it's actually read and write. And the first place where this is being trialed is in CRM applications for kind of like B2B salespeople. And the reason that is, I actually do a lot of machine learning work for B2B sales and marketing. Let me tell you, there's nothing more difficult than convincing salespeople to use CRM to enter what they're doing. It's easier to convince my 4-year-old daughter to eat broccoli than to convince a salesperson to use CRM. And actually, it's not totally irrational. The reason why it's so hard is because there's like a ton of these CRM systems. Everyone is different. And then worse yet, everyone wants to customize their deployment of the CRM. And salespeople move every 2 years. So at some point, they just decide they don't want to learn another CRM system. They just don't use it, right? But in a world in which of like knowing which 17 things to click, you can just say, hey, I had a conversation with this person. Please remind me to call him, in 3 days. This is what I need to talk about. All of a sudden, we are seeing in those companies, CRM usage is going up, right? Because it's easy. So in a lot of these software applications, where people are only using like 10% of the features, like chat UX for many of them is the answer. And then the second most popular use case is the coding assistance. And I think many of you have seen the GitHub study that came out a few months ago with him, and he said like, oh, it's amazing, 56% less time to like develop a coding task. And at Bain, we were like, that sounds too good to be true. We don't believe it. So we ran a survey to see, is this really true? So we talked to 150 like leading software companies who were most likely to actually use this. And we asked about how many were using copilots. And basically 60% are either using it everywhere or at least using it in some pockets and rolling it out to the whole company. And then the rest are actually, there's some informal use and the company doesn't forbid it. It's a tiny little fraction of people that are like either forbid it or have like no usage, right? So like everybody is already using it or about to use it. The interesting thing is, how is it doing? So we asked it like to get like numerical numbers because it's impossible to compare. So we just asked a simple question, which is like, how is it going versus your expectations? With the presumption, with the expectations coming from GitHub. And what came back was super interesting. Like 60% of them said like, actually, it's going as good as we expected or better. Roughly half and half between those two. For only 10%, they were like, it's not as great as we thought. And for the other 30%, it's like basically, well, we only started 2 weeks ago. We don't know yet. That's actually really encouraging that it's actually going that well. I think this is the canary in the coal mine, right? This is the proof point, because this is the only technology that's generative that's actually been in the market for 2 years, and we actually are seeing real results, right? And what are those results? Generally, it's all about just like better code quality and faster time to market. Now, if you actually talk to the executives of the companies, what it'll tell you is the biggest problem for them is that the CEO reads the top stat, 56% faster. Yes, 56% faster on the tasks it can do. And generally, most software engineers don't spend 8 hours a day programming. They spend maybe like 2 hours a day programming. So, okay, you are going to see about like 10 to 20% more productivity. That's kind of like the biggest thing at this point is actually managing expectations of what this can do. Cool. So then, like typically, like when you try to figure out where to use it, at Bain, we would create some sort of like a value chain map. This is for commercial banking. We would break down a company into steps of what it can do. And then we would break it down into internal and customer-facing applications of this technology. And the reason why we break it out into internal and customer-facing is because you want to start with the internal. It's safer. You do not want to expose this to the customer. Remember, it hallucinates a lot. And then we kind of figure out, like, OK, well, where is their value? Where do you have the data to pull it off? What kind of technology is required? And the reality is, each one of these isn't really a use case. It's more like a constellation of use cases. The real version of this looks something like this. That's size 7 font. There's like multiple options for each one. I would be completely insane to try to present this. But I'm sure your favorite consulting companies has one of these. Just ask them for it. Cool. So let's kind of bring this to life. So like in an insurance company, what you can imagine happening is a lot of insurance companies have a ton of different products, and every product has like a bunch of different like T&Cs about like what this covers and doesn't cover. And actually, like when you speak to the agents who are trying to support it or sell it, what they'll tell you is a big issue is like whenever somebody asks them about some product, they have to go to one portal, look for the documentation, read the 30-page document, and find what they need, only to realize like, actually, this is not up to date. Now I have to go to this other portal. It just wastes a lot of time, right? So one of the things this can already do is if you feed all the documents in one place, rather than searching for a document and then to read the most relevant document after you've decided which one is relevant, it actually figures out which document is the most relevant and summarizes it for you in a way in which you want to get it. And you can imagine this goes from like 30 minutes of research on that policy to like 5 minutes, right? And initially, this is used internally only. But you can imagine that in 5 years, when this is proven, it'll be used by everybody, including the customer. The other thing you can do is you can actually listen to the conversation and be like, hey, that person mentioned not having a rental policy. here's the top 3 rental policies that may be relevant, and here's like a one sentence summary for that. That could be like really exciting, right? And then eventually you expose this to the customer, and a customer can like research it themselves, not by reading the document, but by essentially having a conversation with the document, right? Which is like a lot better. The other common one we see a lot is this ad copy idea, which is a lot of companies kind of do mass marketing. And the reason they do mass marketing is because they have to. It's because marketing people are expensive, and they're very cranky with their really cool glasses and cool haircuts. And they only can produce like one marketing campaign per month, which means you kind of have to do mass marketing, right? Well, in a world in which generative AI can actually create like hundreds of ideas per second, and the marketing person now is actually just like evaluating which ones are good and using that as a beginning, you can move from like mass market to like 10 segments to even 100 segments, right? So like we've done this a bunch of times. I didn't have a cool slide for it, but like one of them that I did is for like a low-cost airline. And this low-cost airline always advertises just the airline. And we were telling them, well, actually, this should change your marketing strategy. You should actually not advertise globally, but you should advertise based on the route that people want to take. So if somebody wants to go to Las Vegas, your advertising should be for like why they should go to Las Vegas with you. And this airline is actually like really amazing at like really, really quippy ads. And we did a version of this where it was just like a cool photo and like a cool 20-word slogan. And some of them are really good. Like one of them was like, for Las Vegas, if I remember correctly, it was something like, Las Vegas on airline X, you'll hit jackpot before you even land, right? Because they're known for being cheap, and presumably like getting there cheaply is some sort of a jackpot. But that's pretty good. Some of them were quite cringy, half they were awful, but like in each batch of like 10, there was at least one that was like worthwhile pursuing. So the last bit here about how this can create value, we should also talk about how you can create risk, right? Which is like what happens if you actually don't do this, right? And a lot of CEOs and boards keep asking, like, which industries are at risk? So, or like which industries are safe? And we tried to come up with a framework that prioritizes which industries are safe and which work better. And basically you can't, because there's more diversity within an industry than across industries. I personally tried this for 6 weeks and failed, and we just kind of gave up. And we said, like, look, instead of like an industry view, really what you need to do is kind of like the archetypes of disruption. So the way to read this left to right is, as you go from left to right, it's like very little disruption to, oh my God, I need to drop everything and think about what to do about generative AI, right? So if you're in an industry that's like a lot of physical assets, a lot of physical labor required, it has to happen in person, I don't know, like medicine for most part, or like tailoring, you're probably okay, right? You should adopt generative AI, but only where it's easy and cheap. You're good. You're not going to get disrupted. Kind of like the next tranche over here, it's all about generative AI has the potential to massively reduce the cost, right? If you do a lot of knowledge work, and that's a big part of your cost base, then actually generative AI can like massively reduce the cost. And you don't have to do it, but if you don't, your competitors will. And as a result of that, your competitors are going to have lower cost. And because we live in a capitalist system, that means very soon they're going to lower their prices, and they're going to take all your customers. So in this bucket, you don't have to do it, but if you're the first one to do it, you're probably going to gain share, right? And then as you move to the right, these two are mostly about software companies, so I'm going to skip that. But these are kind of like really kind of like super high risk. Like if what you do is like low complexity knowledge work, and that's your core product, you should be very afraid, right? If you're a call center operator that focuses on kind of like tier 1 tasks that are really easy, you have a big problem, because chatbots are going to be able to do that like within 5-10 years tops. Or if your product is to synthesize a whole bunch of internet data and create that into a report, you have a big problem, because GPT can do that today, right? And if that's the case, it's not a disaster, but you kind of have to like drop everything and do an AI strategy. So that's how we thought about it. Like, if you're more on the left, you're safer. If you're more on the right, you have something to worry about. Cool. So now we're going to talk about, well, how to build it, or as I like to call it, we made a whole bunch of mistakes without knowing it because we were the first ones to go down that path. Let me tell you like what those pitfalls are, so you guys don't have to go through the same thing. So I'm going to split this into kind of 2 broad categories. One is kind of like operation and strategy, and one is more technical. I was planning to do a slide for each one of these bullet points, And then Krešimir had a heart attack and told me very politely but firmly, you are insane, you can do 4. So we're only going to do 4. But I'll highlight some of them. Like when it comes to picking, kind of like there's a bunch of big issues which people kind of like focus too much on value over speed, and they pick problems that are actually too difficult to do. In planning, there's not enough time being spent up front to think about like what is allowable and safe use of data. So then people build a POC, and then they realize half of the data they were using for it, they can't use it because it's extremely unsafe, and they kind of have to go back. When it comes to the organization, massive amount of like under preparation for when you roll this out, right? Because these things work in augment mode. The only way you get the value if people actually adopt it, which means you have to start planning for the adoption at the same time as you start building these things. When it comes to technical challenges, I think we all know this one, hallucinations. It's a huge one. Turns out there are ways to deal with it, right? And the best way to deal with it, if you combine grounding, what grounding means is you read all the data from your own databases into a vector database. And when somebody asks a prompt, you actually do a multi-level search, where first you retrieve all the relevant documents on that topic. You put that into the prompt, and you tell GPT, give the answer, but give the answer only using things in this prompt. Then actually we find the rate of hallucination drops massively because you're not allowing it to use its kind of memory. You're telling it basically use only what I'm telling you that you're allowed to use, and then it does a really good job. Deployment is really hard. It's really hard for 2 reasons. There's a lot of data integration that has to happen, and like this is going to be a huge amount of work going forward, just connecting all of these different systems. And the reason why it's a huge amount of work is because remember, LLMs are really good with very few data sources. So actually some of the data sources that you used to think are useless now become valuable, and you've never connected them before, and now you have to connect them for the first time. And then the ML pipelines looks way different. Even at Bain, we have our own dedicated instance of GPT-4, and we too ran into issues where too many people are using it at once, and we kind of have to throttle. So you kind of have to have a caching strategy. And then again, you have a hallucination. It's not perfectly solved, so you have to have guardrails on the way out to make sure these things don't do something totally stupid. Cool, so if you go to the first one of the big issues people make is they want to build everything because it's exciting. Please don't. Figure out like what's going to be valuable, start preparing the data for it, but then look at like all the startups that are out there. Is one of them solving it? If so, just buy it. Or better yet, if a vendor you already have has this on the roadmap and it's going to be out in the next 12 months, just use theirs. Instead, focus on building things that are like proprietary only for you. That being said, a lot of these startups are just like really thin veneers on top of GPT-4, but that always happens when there's like a new tech disruption. The second thing is that we see a lot of folks make mistakes is that they kind of like, they set the vision too high, and then they try to go for like the big play from the beginning, right? So one of the things we like to do at Bain is this kind of like today forward, future back thinking. And what that means, today forward is like, what are the 3 things I can do like this year that are going to create value this year? But that's too incremental, right? So at the same time, you want to see, cool, and if I take that step, does that lead to some really cool vision 3 years down the road, which we call future back, or what this could be? And then once you have your future back vision and the today forward, you kind of connect the 2, and you say, okay, stepping stone 1, use the data you already have, really simple use case, augment only. Step 2, more data, cooler user interface. Step 3, maybe I'll let it run in the automatic mode, or I'll let it be customer facing, right? But know where you need to go, but do break down your roadmap into tiny little stepping stone. And the key thing is, stepping stone has to be able to create value on its own, right? Because if the first stepping stone is just the proof that it works, but you can't prove it creates value, somebody's going to cancel that project very quickly. And so I'm not going to cover this because I got a signal I only have 3 more minutes to go. But if you think about like indirect sales, like one of the big issues direct sales have is just like they never have the right collateral, right? It's always out of date, or like whoever wrote it down actually isn't an expert in the product and it's totally wrong. So one of the things that we are doing at a bunch of tech companies is actually like they'll have like 5 really good pieces of sales collateral. We'll use that as an example. And then we will read the engineering document, and you can translate from the engineering document to like a sales collateral that is actually really, really simple. And you can do that today, but the long-term vision actually is to read what salespeople are saying on the calls, see which ones have the best sales, and then let the algorithm learn only from the best salespeople because they have figured out like what's the best way to handle that objection, right? But in order to do that, you have to tape every single call, you have to transcribe every single call, you have to monitor all the emails. That's a lot of work. You won't be able to do that in 1 year. I mentioned the MLOps pipeline looks way different. So this is kind of like we took the typical MLOps pipeline, kind of like a simplified version of it. Things in blue are things that are the same. You're just going to have to use more of it. Things in magenta are kind of like things where like you actually have new tools. Old tools no longer work, right? Like for example, all of you are going to get really familiar with vector databases because that's a key thing of how you do grounding. And then things in white that are things that you're not going to use more of or it's not new. And as you'll notice, there is no white. So it's either more of stuff or way different stuff, right? And the reality is like nobody knows how to do this. Everybody's figuring it out. And for many of these, especially in this step, there are no tools. You kind of have to build your own tools. Cool. So this is the end. So kind of like the 5 takeaways. Yep, 5. 1, the interesting thing about this technology is it's ready and it's commercially available. And many people are already experimenting with it because it's an API call. You don't have to build your own model. So the AI race starts 3 months ago. 2, prioritize like tangible benefits. Don't get stuck in endless theoretical debates about what this can and can't do and where there is risk and isn't risk. Just like pick something that's safe and just go do it. And then start experimenting quickly. The reason why this is so important is because all this stuff is new. A lot of your assumptions about how this works are going to be dead wrong, right? So the best way to learn like what's different versus what's new is to just start playing with it. But the important thing is pick something safe, pick something doable, right? Don't pick a high-risk use case because that's going to poison this for your entire company. And then the last thing is it's really, really important that the business is leading the development of this, right? Even more important than traditional AI. Because remember, in order for this to be useful, frontline people have to adopt it, which means the business person has to drive, like what does this need to be, right? And if this business person isn't driving that, it will fail, I guarantee it. And then the size doesn't matter, the size of your organization doesn't matter. What matters is like what data is proprietary to you and how quickly can you move. That is it.